We have an extraordinary session ahead of us in which we are going to gaze into the future. We are going to look into the great crystal ball and imagine 4 different futures for Ukraine and for the world. Before I introduce my fellow panelists, we have 2 American guests who are joining us virtually, one only for the first 10 minutes or so of this session, my old friend Senator Lindsey Graham, and then we will be joined after him, yes, you can indeed applaud, we'll be also joined by my boss, Secretary Condoleezza Rice, who I think will be part of the whole discussion. So I think what we should do, without further ado, is go to Senator Graham. Lindsey, it's good to see you. We are talking about scenarios here in Kyiv. We wish you were with us. And I wondered if I could ask you to discuss 2 specific scenarios that are very much in people's minds here. The scenario for Ukraine if Kamala Harris is the next president of the United States, and the scenario for Ukraine if Donald Trump serves a second term as president of the United States. You're well placed, I think, to help us think about those issues. So maybe you could give us your sense of those 2 scenarios, the Harris scenario and the Trump scenario.
Well, thank you. This is Casual Friday in South Carolina. And to all the panelists and to the people participating in this conference, God bless you. That's a good question. The Ukraine supplemental that we passed to give them more money and more aid and more military support had a requirement, Neil, for the Biden administration to present to Congress sort of a game plan. How does this thing end? So, as to Trump, I am confident that he will make sure this ends in a way not to create new wars. I would hope that's the Harris position. How does it end? We're not taking Moscow. They're not taking Kyiv. There will be a political settlement. And how that settlement plays out is the most important decision the world will make in the early part of the 21st century. So Harris, Trump. The real question for me is, what will we do to end this war, and how will we end this war? If it's like 2014, where there will be a third invasion, we will have failed miserably. If it is seen that Putin was rewarded for this, there goes Taiwan. So I've talked to President Trump about your desire to end this war is noble. But how you end this war will be the most important decision the next American president will make, whether it's Harris or whether it's Trump. The decision to get out of Afghanistan, in my view, was ill-conceived and set in motion the invasion of Ukraine and a lot of other bad things in the world. It's not when we left Afghanistan that mattered the most to me, it's what we left behind. And what did we leave behind? The Taliban taking over the country, the rise of radical Islam, shaking allies throughout the world about our reliability. This is a mulligan in Trump terms. You have a chance to deal with an aggressor here. I'm not out to humiliate Putin, but I am out to make a statement that taking the land of others by military force is not a good way to behave. So what will Harris do? She's all in supporting Ukraine. I appreciate that. Well, let Ukraine use missiles to full effect. The problem I've got with the Biden administration is their rhetoric doesn't really match the resolve we need to get Putin to the table. Neil, he'll only come to the table when the pain is great. They oppose making Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. I think if anybody on the planet should be considered a state sponsor of terrorism, it would be Putin and Putin's Russia. So limiting the use of long-range missiles to hit legitimate military targets like air bases in Russia just sends the wrong signal. J.D. Vance talked about, some of the things that may happen as part of ending the war. I want to make sure that China sees that Putin made a mistake, that they're less likely to invade Taiwan because NATO held together. So where are we at? NATO is bigger. The Russian economy has been sanctioned, and Putin's an indicted war criminal. That narrative, I hope China is paying attention to. The fact that NATO's expanded and people are showing resolve is probably the man of the year for NATO should be Putin. He's done more to unite the alliance than any single person I know. Trump talks about ending the war. He didn't mention the word winning. And the reason I think that doesn't bother me is that winning has to be put in terms of what's your goal. My goal is that territorial integrity of Ukraine is honored, that whatever settlement we have about land will be seen as not rewarding Putin, that the likelihood of a third invasion is off the table. Learn from the 2014 agreement. If we don't move Ukraine toward NATO, that will be a mistake. If we don't have security guarantees, that would be a mistake. So I would wonder about what Harris would do. Would Harris allow more offensive capability? Would she accelerate the military capability that Ukraine needs to get Putin to the table? I don't know. Here's what I think Trump will do. He'll try to end the war. But if Putin insists upon a settlement that would basically set in motion Afghanistan on steroids, I think he'll tell Putin, I'm going to give Ukraine everything they need. So the American president, whoever he or she may be, is going to be an instrumental player in bringing this war to an end. I've been to Ukraine 6 times. I want to say this. We were briefed right after the invasion, Neil, that Kyiv would fall in 4 days, and there'd be an insurgency throughout Ukraine, and the whole country would collapse in 3 weeks. Here we are all these days later. Ukraine is still standing. They're fighting like tigers. Not one American has died. Not one American has been injured. This is the partner and ally I have been dreaming of for decades. Why am I so all in for Ukraine? I don't believe Putin will stop unless somebody makes him. I hope the next president understands that. Whether it's Harris or Trump, I hope you understand that Ukraine is doing the world a great service by stopping Putin before we get in a conflict with NATO. Putin said yesterday, I think, if you allow long-range weapons to be used against military targets inside of Russia, that will be at war with NATO. No, we won't. Don't let him make policy. Call his bluff. So, as to me as a Republican, if Trump wins, I will do everything I can to ensure that he understands that it's not when we win the war, it's how we end the war. That I want to stop the killing and I want to stop the bloodshed. But let's don't make the mistakes of 2014. Let's don't make this Afghanistan on steroids. Let's don't entice China to be more aggressive. So to my friends in Ukraine, I admire you. You need to start thinking about what is a good end for you. I'm looking to President Zelensky to give me some guidance as to what's acceptable. I've talked to him about it. I think I have a general idea of what he's going to announce in a week or two, Neil. And I'm hoping that he not only will talk to President Biden, but brief President Trump. And with that, I just want to thank you for the conference. Thank you for the attention. Probably the most important decision since the end of World War II for Europe. We've enjoyed 80 years of relative peace. NATO has been one of the greatest investments in the history of the American taxpayer, I think. A lot's at risk here. So I hope President Harris will understand it's just not what you say about Ukraine, it's are you giving the Ukrainians the ability to put pressure on Putin to bring him to the table. I hope President Trump understands it's not when the war ends, 48 hours or 24 hours is how it ends. So what's my job? I'm going to, God willing, be in the Senate. And no matter who's president, I'm going to do my part to encourage them to pursue an end of the war that is honorable, that will make sure that military aggression by other bad actors is less likely to happen, to send a clear signal to China, and to let Putin and everybody who wants to be a Putin in the future know you're going to pay a heavy price. One of the most important decisions we will make as in the world here is coming up. In many ways, this is the 30s all over again. I'll end with this. There's two scenarios. We can end this war in a way to have more wars. We can end this war in a way to entice more aggression in other areas of the world. We can end this war where nobody would like to align with us because we will throw you under the bus. We can end this war where Putin is more likely to expand after the end to other areas because he thinks we're all talk. The best way to stop a third invasion is to make sure that the Ukrainian military has everything they need to defend their territory. And one thing I can say, I've been unbelievably impressed with their ability and will to fight and how they've taken our technology and used it to full advantage. They have driven the Black Sea fleet away from Ukrainian waters virtually without a navy. We're learning a lot about the use of drones and creativity on the battlefield. Ukraine is teaching me and others what the face of a new war would look like. So if Harris wins, I hope she will not only talk about helping Ukraine, but unleash the Ukraine military in a way to get Putin at the table. If Trump wins, I hope he will be focused on not the day you end the war, but how you end the war. The role I play is to help either one of them and to make sure that Congress is in the camp of giving Ukraine what they need to end this war honorably. To all those who are participating, thank you. To my friends in Ukraine, I admire you greatly. We have your back. God bless.
Thank you very much indeed, Senator. And thank you for entering into the spirit of our discussion by considering those two scenarios. In fact, we've had to consider 4 scenarios in preparing for this discussion. And our challenge is that we've read them and you have not. So I'm going to try to outline the 4 different scenarios that this panel has considered. Before I do that, I want briefly to introduce them to you. Some are known to you, some perhaps newer to this conference. From my right, your left, my old friend and co-author Moritz Schularick, now president of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Sitting next to him, my colleague at Stanford, Francis Fukuyama, famous around the world for the end of history, but of course a prolific author on a whole range of extraordinarily important topics of political science, and a commentator on this conflict since it broke out. Sitting next to him, Ihor Zhovkva, the deputy head of the office of the president of Ukraine, and to my immediate right, Gabrielius Landsbergis, the foreign minister of Lithuania, from whom we already heard earlier today. We also have another virtual guest, panelist. I hope she's about to appear so that I can introduce her. I'm looking rather hopelessly at the screen and seeing only my own receding hairline, so I can only hope that Condoleezza Rice is going to appear in a moment. While we wait for her, let me briefly sketch 4 futures. The Yes team commissioned 4 scenarios from 4 different authors and sets of authors, and they range from the bleak to the euphoric. Let me briefly sketch each one so that you get a sense of what we've been thinking about. These will be published subsequent to this event. For the sake of brevity, I can only really offer you brief sketches. Liana Fix's Losing the Long Game imagines a bad scenario. I'm not going to say necessarily the worst case scenario. She imagines that an agglomeration of conflicts and a return of global threats such as terrorism leads to a weakening of support for Ukraine, and it's the distraction of Ukraine's allies that leads to an outcome that is, to say the least, suboptimal. Indeed, this scenario culminates in 2030. That was the time horizon that the authors were given, in which Russian troops operating from Belarus launch an attack on Lithuania. That's certainly the worst case scenario from your point of view. We're lucky to have one of the authors, Happerman Jacob, with us. Of 2030, the Russia-Ukraine war has become less intense, but the globe has become more unstable. And I'd say Happerman is the not quite so bad, but not really very good scenario. I'm going to get him later to say a bit more about that, but just for the sake of setting the scene, this is a scenario in which in 2030, the war is still going on, but it hasn't massively escalated. It's a sort of low intensity, recurring conflict of the sort that perhaps we're familiar with. Support for Ukraine hasn't been abandoned by the West, but it has certainly dwindled. Happerman, it's great to have you here, and I want to give you a chance to say more about how that scenario would play out. The third scenario is from Marie Mandras of Sciences Po, Ukraine 2030, the invention of European security. And in this scenario, Ukraine, with the support of its allies, defeats Russia and indeed achieves Russia's total surrender. And on this basis, not only does Ukraine achieve victory, that it becomes a kind of role model for the European Union and a new era of successful international collective security. Another author of the fourth scenario is with us, Timothy Milanov. I've mispronounced your name, but sorry. And I'll get you, Timothy, later on to say a few words about yours. Your scenario is Ukraine's victory in the war. What does it mean? And this is a scenario which envisions a Ukrainian victory, followed not only by Ukraine joining NATO, but by a general improvement in international institutions. And I'm glad to see that my filibustering strategy worked, and Condi is now on the line. Condi, it's great to have you here virtually. Can I ask you, when you were National Security Advisor and Secretary of State with President George W. Bush, did you find it useful to think about scenarios in this kind of way? And if you did, what are the kind of scenarios Ukraine should be thinking about today?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. And I really want to say to everyone gathered there how incredibly inspirational Ukraine continues to be to the world. It's inspirational to me and to those of you who are there at the YES conference. I'm very glad you're there. Planning for the future of Ukraine, because I think we need to start thinking about the future of Ukraine. And in that context, Niall, scenarios can be very helpful. I am probably not given to grand scenarios, that is, that where everything has been tied up in a bow, either to the negative side or to the positive side, but rather to think about elements of various scenarios. And that's the kind of scenario planning that I found most useful as National Security Advisor and as Secretary of State. I might also note that I was the Soviet specialist for George H.W. Bush when we unified Germany. And that was a pretty positive development. And so the scenario planning for that might also be very useful. So what might some of those be? On the negative side, have you really done enough scenario planning for an all-out assault on Ukraine's electrical infrastructure? What would you do under those circumstances? A lot of it is already in the books from what Ukraine has done, but I think you have to look to issues like cybersecurity. Are you continuing to use scenarios that give you cybersecurity plans? One that people often don't think about, but we thought a lot about in the United States, continuity of government. What if something were to happen at the top end of government? And that's very hard to do. But I actually was one of the people who used to do exercises about continuity of government. What if the U.S. government were unable to act because of an attack? What would we do? And I'm going to tell you, Niall, on September 11th, that came in handy because for several hours, the U.S. government actually wasn't able to act. The vice president and I and a few others were in a bunker. The president was trying to get to a safe location. And some of the planning that we had done on continuity of government turned out to be very, very helpful. So I think it's useful to have scenarios, but I would probably plan for more specific circumstances that you might have to deal with. I will say one thing about one final positive one. Start to think about what constitutes a free, independent, democratic, secure, and prosperous Ukraine. What does that mean in terms of access to the Black Sea? What does that mean in terms of investment in Ukraine? And start to think about the circumstances that might produce that.
Thank you, Condi. Can I ask a quick follow-up question? I don't know if you heard Lindsey Graham just a moment ago talking about the two political scenarios that we have to imagine after November 5th. If you think about this from the vantage point of the next administration, whether it's led by a Democrat or a Republican, what do you think is the best case scenario for the United States? Because I've learned from writing Henry Kissinger's biography that a Secretary of State's job is not to work out what's best for Ukraine, really. It's to work out what is best for the United States. In that realist perspective, what is the best case scenario for the next US administration with respect to this war that is going on here?
Well, with the caveat that I would be careful about listening to anything that's said in our presidential campaign. Neil, everyone says, on day one, I will. And then on day one, they don't. And so I think we have to be a little bit careful because there will be a lot said that will never come to pass. But I think the best scenario for the United States is that we begin to develop together with Ukraine and with our European allies a very clear vision of what a prosperous, secure, independent, and democratic Ukraine is going to look like. What is our role in that as the United States of America? I've said publicly, it may not be, I think we should continue support to Ukraine, but can it be at the levels that it has been? I think that will be a question. What can we do to encourage investment in Ukraine? There are parts of Ukraine that are relatively peaceful and where every day coders and software engineers are working. What can the United States do to encourage investment? We have a lot of investment vehicles that we've used. I know that Penny Pritzker has been working, the former Secretary of Commerce has been working on some of those. What will be the nature of America's role in Ukraine's security in the future? And then I think the allies have to do the same thing, the European allies. And then finally, Ukraine needs to think about what is its part in that. And I would just emphasize one thing in particular. In terms of defense capability and defense industry, Ukraine has a lot of capability, many, many assets. How can those be maximized even beyond what we're seeing right now, where the drones that Ukraine is producing have done something quite remarkable? Without a navy, Ukraine has neutralized the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the vaunted, historically iconic Russian Black Sea Fleet. So I would divide this into a set of discussions after January's inauguration, a set of discussions starting at the level of national security officials and experts, maybe including some people who come from the outside. Neil, there are people at the Hoover Institution who are interested in these questions. What now should the United States' proper role be? What's Ukraine's proper role be? And how are we going to mesh that together? Because I do think we have to start thinking about how we end up in the place that we want to be.
Thank you, Condi, and I hope you can stay on the line as we go to the discussion that's happening here in the room in Kyiv. Frank Fukuyama, I want to get your thoughts on best and worst case scenarios. I think of some of your early commentary after the war broke out as being amongst the most optimistic writing, and you envisioned a Ukrainian victory before most people had the courage to talk about that scenario. How are you thinking about the war now, as it's now in its third year, and do you still have a best case scenario in mind?
Well, I do have a best case scenario, Niall, but I'm not going to talk about that. I was at one point part of something called the Global Business Network that was set up by Peter Schwartz to help corporations do scenario planning. And one of the things that he always cautioned is do not attach probabilities to any of the scenarios in your matrix, because the moment you see a low probability, you're not going to think about it. You're just going to concentrate on the things that are probable. And I have a suspicion in this room, ever since Kamala Harris stepped forward and Joe Biden stepped down, and since the debate, that you're kind of discounting what I think is the absolutely worst case scenario, and that is if Donald Trump is elected president. There's still a pretty close to 50-50 chance that that is going to happen. And I understand why the Ukrainians in this room don't want to talk a lot about how bad it's going to be if he's president. I'm an American. I can do that. I can say whatever the hell I want. I used to be a Republican up until 2010, when I think the party just went off the rails. But I think that actually we should take seriously the things that Donald Trump says, and he is not going to be good for Ukraine. He obviously admires Putin. We saw during the debate how easily manipulated he was. Kamala Harris was extremely skillful in triggering him into paroxysms of anger over things like crowd sizes. And that's obviously what Putin has done with him in the other direction, Xi Jinping as well. And so he has this admiration for strong men. He wants to settle the war. He didn't say he wanted a victory. That's very significant, because I think basically he'll settle the war on Putin's terms, with Ukraine giving up as much territory as necessary. But the thing I want to emphasize is that apart from all the specific things that you can intuit about his relative feelings about Russia versus Ukraine, you have to think about the larger position of America in the world if he is president. And that is really what worries me, because the single thing that has weakened America at the present moment and allowed people like the Chinese to say that America is in decline is the extreme degree of polarization in our country. And it's come to a head over things like, should we continue to vote money to aid Ukraine militarily? The polarization is not symmetrical. There is an out-to-lunch progressive left wing in the Democratic Party, but the polarization has been driven overwhelmingly by a shift on the extreme right wing of the Republican Party, represented by Donald Trump, towards isolationism. There's no other way to put this. The Republican Party was isolationist up until the Second World War. It's returning to those roots. That's what Make America Great Again means. Donald Trump talked about wanting to withdraw from NATO, and he's still complaining about, and in fact inviting the Russians to attack countries that don't pay their dues to NATO in his view. John Bolton has said that he was told that that was his intention had he won the presidency in 2020. And then you think about the economic part of his agenda, not just, basically ending economic relations with China, but 10% tariff on every other country, friend or foe, around the world. That's the way he's going to raise revenue in his ideal world. Now, it may be, as the two previous speakers have suggested, that he won't actually be able to get away with a lot of this. But I just ask you to think about what the world and what kind of a scenario is going to emerge where, in general, the United States of America, the world's leading democracy, is led by a basically isolationist party that does not want to have serious commitments or enduring alliance commitments, and does not regard the international support of democracy to be a chief priority in American foreign policy. Senator Graham described what a Republican administration would look like if he were president, but he's not going to be president, unfortunately. Donald Trump is going to be president.
So, Frank and I,
yes,
as moderator, just ask a follow-up question. We heard Mike Pompeo earlier on this stage. He did not sound like an isolationist to me. I read Robert O'Brien's important essay in Foreign Affairs earlier this year, former National Security Advisor. That was certainly not an isolationist essay. And I'm struggling to know who would be staffing an isolationist administration. It seems to me all of the national security likely picks in a Trump administration are not themselves isolationists.
We could get into a long discussion of Schedule F and the plans for restaffing a future Republican administration.
It's not like Tucker Carlson's going to be Secretary of State. Let's be realistic here. If Mike Pompeo's at Defense and O'Brien's Secretary of State, it seems to me the national security team is not isolationist.
That's a lot of ifs that discounts everybody but the President of the United States, and I think that's going to matter. Look, this is a session on scenarios. I am not saying that this is the most likely scenario. I actually sort of think that Kamala is likely to win, and therefore that focus is appropriate. But you asked to talk about worst-case scenarios, and I am laying out a worst-case scenario that seems to me not so implausible, given who actually is leading the Republican Party at this moment.
I was really struck by the fact that the worst-case scenario that we were given to read starts from the premise that Kamala Harris wins the election and everything goes well for about a year, and then a crisis in the Middle East and a resurgence of terrorism distracts the United States, and on a Harris presidency you end up with Ukraine in dire straits. So I think that's one of the more interesting quirks about the exercise that we've carried out. But thank you for bringing in the Trump scenario. I want to turn to Moritz Schularick next, because Moritz, you have been doing some incredibly important work at the Kiel Institute on the support tracker. Anybody who's serious about following support for Ukraine goes to the Kiel regular update Kiel support tracker. And you've just published a rather devastating report on what might be called German non-rearmament. Moritz, you're an economic historian and an economist by training. Can you help us think about the economic scenarios that Ukraine and, for that matter, Russia currently confront?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Niall. So maybe let's start with the study. It's indeed, we've published it just on Tuesday, and it's on our website just next to the Ukraine support tracker that you hopefully know. And it looks at the pace of rearmament in Germany after the famous Zeitenwende speech that, you know, so the idea that Germany is going to take over more responsibility for security and defense affairs. And what can I tell you? The news is not good. There are 2 points, really. The first one is that at the current speed of rearmament that has happened since 2022, it will take decades to get back to where Germany was 20 years ago. Depends on where you look at combat aircraft or military vehicles, but we're talking about a pace that's very slow and will take decades to get back to where the country once was. So it looks to us like a lot of lip service, and on the ground things have been very, very slow to take off. The second big point of that study is, and maybe even more concerning, is that the relative speed between the buildup of Russian military production capacities and what has happened in Germany has gone in the wrong direction. So Russia has been much faster than Germany and Western Europe, for that sake, in increasing its production capacities. And just to give you an idea about what we're speaking right now, we're speaking about, at the current speed of production, Russia can replace the entire German stock of tanks, combat aircraft, etc., within a matter of 6 to 7 months. So the pace of production in Russia is so fast, and the stocks in Germany is so low that no much happening. Maybe one last point, Niall, just because it's important when you mention our support tracker. There is this idea, and Condoleezza Rice mentioned it as well just a couple of minutes ago, that we've done so much and we need to think about where we go from here. As a macroeconomist, I beg to disagree. If you look at what Germany is doing this year, and the number for the US is very similar, in terms of military aid for Ukraine, we're talking about 0.1% of GDP. That number is very similar for the US. So we're devoting a tiny fraction of our annual production to supporting Ukraine. And that number is one that you have to, even if you add in other additional aid, we're far from committing massive resources in support of Ukraine. Again, just to give you an idea, Germany spends more every year on subsidies for diesel, that great technology of the future, than it does on military aid for Ukraine. So that narrative that we're doing so much and it's stretching us to the limit is just false.
Neil, may I just comment?
Please do comment.
Yeah, let's be very clear. I have not said, and I don't think anyone thinks we're massively spending on Ukraine. That's not really the issue. I personally would massively spend on Ukraine. And I actually think had we gotten to Ukraine everything that was possible for them to use in this war when the Russians were still on their back foot, we might be in a very different position now. But the kind of doing this incrementally, well, now let's talk about tanks. Well, yes, we'll send tanks. Let's talk about long-range artillery. Now we'll send long-range artillery. Let's talk about fighter aircraft. Now we'll send fighter aircraft. If at the beginning of this war we had said, what does Ukraine need for victory against a reeling Russia at this point, we might be in a different position. We do have to note, as we're looking at scenarios, that there are questions about how much more mobilization there can be of resources, even if that would be what we would recommend. And what might that mobilization look like? What is the proper role of the United States, of Europe, and of Ukraine in mobilizing to bring the conclusion to this war as one that we would want? So I don't want to be associated with the notion that we've done a lot for Ukraine and shouldn't do more. I do think we probably made a mistake in not doing it more aggressively at the beginning.
Thanks, Condi. I've just been told that Minister Landsbergis has to leave rather sooner than I had been led to expect. Maybe you just found that out too. But such is power and the responsibilities of it. In the scenario that I cited earlier, the worst case scenario, the culmination, I'll quote, is, on the morning of February the 18th, 2030, Russian troops operating from Belarus appeared in the Lithuanian city of Ruskininkai, catching NATO by surprise. Within hours, they advanced along the Suwalki Gap and linked the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad with a direct land route to Belarus. The Baltics were cut off by land from NATO. Is that the kind of scenario that keeps you awake at night?
Well, when we think about the worst case scenarios, that's definitely the kind of scenario that is involved in the decision-making process that we think about in my country. When I was listening to the scenarios that you've laid out, I kind of tried to get into the shoes of the people who were writing down the scenarios. And I was thinking about the variables that you have to see in your mind in order to lay out the scenario. And I figured that there's a difference how a country like mine would set out working on a certain scenario than, for example, a political scientist somewhere else. And we would divide. We would divide the scenario in two parts, and let's call it blue team and red team. When it comes to red team, we in Lithuania, and I'm sure that many Ukrainians would agree, we don't see many variables currently. Putin is aggressive. He has no reason not to be aggressive. He can continue. He is rebuilding. Sanctions are not biting enough. So if you were to ask me if I can tell you what Putin might be thinking 5 years from now, I probably could, with high level of certainty, could tell you. Now, when you think about the blue team, this is where variables are. And this is what we don't know. This is what drives the scenarios. We have the ability to stop Putin. We have the ability to fight him in Ukraine and throw him out. We have the ability to make sure that he's unable to continue any war that he has planned. But I cannot tell you whether we are going to do any of it. And that's the biggest premise for any scenario to think of. We know what Putin is going to do. We know what he wants to do. We know what he wants to achieve. He wants to rebuild as large an empire as possible. That's his history book. That's where he sees his place. This is what he's trying to achieve. We have not yet been able to figure out our place in that history book.
If all the yes, well said. If all the European members of NATO increase defense spending to the kind of rates of gross domestic product that we see in Poland and in the Baltic states, I think that would be the game-changing variable. Would you agree? Because implicit in Moritz's analysis is if only Germany would step up, then the resources would be available to compete with the Russian military. Do you, I mean, you attend these meetings, you understand the politics of the other member countries. Do you think it's going to change? Or in the end, are the other, particularly the bigger European economies, simply not going to step up?
Well, in his initial speech, Victor was kind enough to remind one example that I've used during our Davos breakfast, where I compared Poland and Ukraine. I can use another example. And there are people in this room who actually seen it happening with their own eyes. I've seen some generals here. First, Iraq war. How many tanks did it take for US and allies to throw Iraq out of Kuwait? Roughly 4,000. How many troops? 800,000 troops. This is the commitment. Now when we talk about 31 Abrams tank, really, I mean, I cannot even start debating about seriousness of our commitment when it comes to, I will make a comment here, heavy equipment. Heavy equipment. If we want to be serious, the numbers are so vast that in my previous panel, I've talked about the social contract. And here, the other people who spoke, I mean, they're right. You have to have an agreement with your population, right? It's impossible now to at least imagine that, for example, UK, before the Second World War, had about 4% of GDP towards defense. The peak during the war was 50. But now imagine going from where we are currently, 2%, maybe a bit lower, to doubling it. I mean, you would have revolution, basically. I mean, you cannot borrow that much, you cannot print that much without the financial implications that would, damage the economy. You cannot have this. So you need an agreement with your people. But what I'm suggesting is that when you say that you are unable to have an agreement right now, then you have to be clear and you have to tell that without this agreement, we have to agree that the war will continue. And most likely, not just Ukraine will be involved in this. Most likely, NATO will be tested, other countries will be tested. That means that our social contract, rewriting of social contract, has to encompass not just the financial part, but the geostrategic part of what is about to come.
Ihor, Zhovkva, you've been very patient listening to all these foreigners talk about the scenarios that will decide the fate of Ukraine to be or not to exist. Having read the scenarios and listened to this conversation, where do you find yourself now? Are any of these scenarios useful to you? And if so, which one do you focus on? The best case, the worst case, the in-between case?
Niall, thank you. With all respect to the foreigners, I can only talk today about one scenario, and only one. When Ukraine wins, not if, when Ukraine wins, what should all we do in order to prevent the repetition of the situation in future? Because with all respect to the foreigners, in 2008, you missed the chance of changing the current situation when NATO issued a decision, infamous Bucharest summit decision, Ukraine will be in NATO, and nothing in practice, no map, nothing. Then in 2014, you also missed the chance to react more aggressively, like Condoleezza said today, to what Russia was starting to do first in the Crimea and then in the part of the Donbas. Again, the missed chance. Now, as we speak, and as Ukraine is nearing to the victory, let's think of what we all can do already now, and especially when we win, in order to prevent these kinds of aggressions in future. Because when we win, will Russia disappear? Unfortunately not. Will it dismantle into several parts? Okay, scientists might have their theories, but mostly not. Will Ukraine be placed in some other part of the world? No, it will be here in the eastern part of the continent. So what we all should do now in order to understand that these mistakes which we all made will not happen in future. First, and we talk today all the day about defense for Ukraine, to arm Ukraine as strongly as possible for us to be able not to defend only ourselves, but this part of the world, or this part of the European continent and the European continent. Security. We do understand that current system of security, international world order, has failed to prevent Russian aggression. We failed to prevent Russian aggression. What does it mean? We need to think about some new things, some new system of the world security. Maybe it's not high time now, but maybe yes. We are now doing our job, our part of the job together with you. Today it was mentioned several times about security agreements my country is having with many countries, so the representatives are present today, with Lithuania, with other countries, 26 and some more to be negotiated. What do we have in these securities? First, it's military support to Ukraine in order to be able to defend itself and the rest of the continent. Second, and it was told about today many times, yes, intensive, long-standing support, military support for Ukraine. Moritz, you are talking 0.1%. We managed to insert 0.25% in 3 agreements with Baltic states, with Lithuania, with Latvia and Estonia. 0.25% of GDP for military support of Ukraine. What if other countries of NATO would follow at least this example, starting from this year and the next 10 years on? What if? Secondly, the strong mechanism of reaction if aggression will repeat again or if aggression will escalate. 24 hours. So with all respect to NATO procedures, even NATO procedures are slow. Maybe we are, a little bit naive, but we don't want it again. Today we spoke about this. Budapest Memorandum turned out to be a piece of paper. We don't want to have another pieces of paper. We won't have to, all of you to think what will be your reaction, much stronger than in 2014, much stronger than in the beginning of the open Russian aggression, if this will happen again. Second part, very important, accountability. If Putin and his cronies will be left unpunished for the crime of aggression, crime of all crimes, this will happen again, whatever the surname will be. If current mandate of ICC doesn't allow the punishment for the crime of aggression, let's establish international tribunal. If you are not agreeing, not all of you are agreeing on the modality we are suggesting, let's think about some ideas, but these villains should not be left unpunished. Full stop. And third, very important also, we should talk already now about recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine in order Ukraine to be, again, strong enough to withstand the aggression. Now it's high time to think about this, and that's why my president also raises this issue already now, when we're still fighting, but many of the territories are liberated, and we need to build a new, stronger, and yes, economically stronger Ukraine. In this part also comes sanctions. Sanctions do work. The stronger, the louder Russians say that sanctions do not work, they are really working. So this is also the component which we are solving. This is the scenario I want to talk about, and let's start to implement it already today.
But I've got to be devil's advocate here and say that would be great, but politics is politics. It's politics in Washington, it's politics in Berlin. If one looks at the likely political outlook for the next 12 months, it is hard to see a massive increase in military support for Ukraine sufficient to bring Putin to the negotiating table. If you put yourself in his position and think what his scenarios are, surely there's a very tempting scenario just to let this war of attrition continue, knowing that you have the greater resources and that ultimately Ukraine will not be able to sustain this war of attrition for another year. Is there not a danger that in pursuing the policy that you've described, you risk ultimately defeat from exhaustion, defeat from simply not having the economic resources, defeat because your allies are not as supportive as Russia's allies are when it comes to military hardware? Isn't that the downside scenario that you must think about if you are to lead this country responsibly?
The answer to this question, which you are putting absolutely rightfully, depends on all the countries which are with Ukraine today. Once again, yes, time plays at Putin's hands. We do understand this. The intensity of support, again, it depends on all of you. My president spends, days and nights talking to the leaders, explaining, talking in the very concrete details about, we sometimes have this joke. Now, my president knows the situation in your warehouses and storages and armed forces better than any of your ministers, defense, or even presidents or prime ministers. We don't demand something which will undermine the capabilities, the military capabilities of your countries, but certainly we do count on this support. If Germany this year spent almost 8 billion euros for the military support, it should not be downplayed the next year. Why we're inputting these numbers into the agreements which signed by the leaders of the countries? Because yes, we do calculate, we do count on the same amount. We believe you, we trust you. I hope you will not deceive us. Secondly, how to make Putin whatever he wants, sit on the table, whatever. We need to act in the strong, united voice. And once again, I'm coming to the topic of the peace summit, on the peace process. 101 participants at the first summit. Many would tell us, let's not do this peace conference. Let's postpone it. Let's do it later. We did it, and I think together with the partners, and I think we're right. When Putin will hear the united voice, stronger and stronger, of European countries, of the Euro-Atlantic world, of global South countries, many of them were participating of the summit. Some of them are still, cautious, but look what difference is compared even to the beginning of open Russian aggression. When African leaders, several of them, came here to Kyiv to meet my president with their own African plan, and after the meeting with President said, no, Mr. President, we don't need any African plan. We do understand that the only plan of peace to Ukraine can be of Ukrainian origin because the war is going on the territory of Ukraine. It can be contributed by the other inputs, which we're gladly welcoming. But sorry, no African plans anymore. So Putin is afraid of force. If all of you will speak in with him on forcefully rather than appeasingly, then we will win.
I've just been handed a card saying that Minister Landsbergis needs to leave, which is unfortunate because I think you had a last word that you wanted to interject. Do you want to say something before you have to leave?
If I'm still allowed.
It might have to be brief.
Yeah. That's exactly the same question. The one that you've posed was posed 5 minutes after the first bullets flew in this war. The question was, this war is doomed. Ukraine is doomed. The president has to leave the country. How many things have changed since that question was posed? And why does one need to believe that this question today is the right one when it was asked in the past and it was the wrong one?
It's also worth remembering, apropos of Moritz, that the scenarios that we considered in that first 6 months of the war were, well, how quickly will the Russian economy collapse? And whenever doing scenario planning, one has to remember how wrong the scenarios usually turn out to be. We must let you go. Obviously, business is pressing. A big hand for Minister Landsbergis. We have, however, a good half hour of discussion left, and I want to take this opportunity, because in a way the Global South was just mentioned, to bring in one of our scenario writers. Hapimon Jacob is a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and is somebody extremely well versed in Indian foreign policy. And so I was particularly interested to see him writing a scenario which imagines an altogether messier outcome to this war. One idea that's particularly interesting is that the conflict drags on and the two sides end up agreeing to a series of, quote, war management agreements brokered by third parties with permanent ceasefire zones, humanitarian corridors, prisoner exchanges, de-escalation protocols. I found that interesting because it's not unimaginable in the context of Asian wars in recent memory. So can I invite you, Hapimon, to talk a little bit about how you see this from a South Asian perspective, because I think it would be really illuminating. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Niall. I must say that I am a political scientist based in a foreign country, so I come with a great deal of humility to this discussion here. But I must say that I completely agree with Secretary Rice when she said she's not given to grand scenarios. I think that makes a lot of sense because, sometimes extreme scenarios are more appealing, more sexy, and they sound fantastic. But the reality is somewhat different on the ground. I think the intermediate scenarios, like the one I sort of created for you, is in some ways more, as you said, messy, incomplete, evolving, and not so, let's say, not so sexy. But I think this is more realistic. And also, as you correctly pointed out, Niall, it is also reflective of the kind of background and situation that I come from, where wars tend to go on for a longer period. India and Pakistan, for example, we also have an outstanding conflict with China, for example, and we've managed to sort of live next to each other without really tearing off each other's heads, and sort of having agreed to war management, ceasefires, and things of that kind on the ground. But let me sort of very quickly, in about 2 minutes or so, try and highlight some of the key takeaways from the scenario that I built. First of all, as you correctly pointed out, the scenario does not envisage a complete end to the war. And to that extent, it is not an entirely optimistic scenario. And it is certainly not an optimistic scenario for the international system, as it were. But the scenario does predict the containment of the intensity of the war that is happening at this point of time. We are talking about 6 years from now. It's set in 2030. You're talking about Ukraine being a part of the European Union at some point of time, around that time perhaps, that's a prediction. A war-weakened Russia without too many friends. You're talking about in Iran and perhaps North Korea, etc. It's a war-weakened Russia in that sense. You're also looking at a militarily versatile Ukraine, after having received sophisticated weapons and training from United States and its European allies. You're looking at a very versatile, militarily versatile Ukraine. It, however, predicts Ukraine's inability to sort of take back much of the territory that it has lost since 2014, but the war management mechanisms, in some ways, you may look at the war management mechanisms and says, what are these things about? But the war management mechanisms are also in some ways able to take care of one of Ukraine's most important fears, which is what will happen in future. So if you have third-party mediated war management mechanism between Russia and Ukraine, that also in some ways acts as a, let's say, small guarantee to ensure that Russian aggression in future will also be contained. But I think I want to sort of bring your attention to something more important, which is the pressure of other global issues will eventually overtake the Ukraine situation. I mean, we can't live in a cocoon thinking that this is going to be the state of affairs from 5 years from now, 10 years from now. No, unfortunately not. This is going to be one of the many issues on the global stage, and the American president and others will have to deal with. The urgency will wear off eventually. The current focus is the current focus on the Ukraine war is bound to decline. And I mean, I hope this continues, but unfortunately, that's not how the international system functions. You're looking at great power, attention going to be elsewhere. China is a rising power, rising superpower, a peer competitor to the United States, and the Americans will have to focus on China. And so primary contradiction is perhaps not going to be Russia in that sense. So, I mean, after having said all of this, I don't think my scenario is all that bad for Ukraine. Think of it this way. It is pretty bad for Russia, if I may put it that way. It's certainly terrible for the rest of the international community. If Ukraine can actually manage to keep up this momentum, and I think that is going to be pretty good, even if it is unable to take back the land it has lost since 2014. The question, on the other hand, is will Russia be able to increase the momentum in order to meet its objectives in this war? It is unlikely to do that. So, on balance, therefore, my sense is that even if we are looking at a continuation of this war with less intensity and Ukraine being part of EU and a war weakened Russia, it's good news for Ukraine, in my opinion.
I want to throw this back to Condoleezza Rice in a moment, because I think the point is very well taken that this war is taking place in a complex international context. We're approaching the anniversary of October the 7th, which almost overnight shifted American attention from Ukraine to Israel and the Middle East, and who knows what lies ahead in other geographies. Before I come back to you, Condi, I'd just like to invite Timothy to say a little bit about his scenario, which uses a very different analogy. Your point is that it's a little 1938 all over again, and Ukraine is Czechoslovakia, and the lesson of history is that if the West acts now to halt aggression, it will pay a lower price than if it waits and allows the aggressor to pursue an even more ambitious goal. So talk a little bit about your scenario, and maybe address some of the questions that the panelists have raised. How do you get, for example, Germany to be more committed to the defeat of Russia in Ukraine than it currently is?
Thank you. So there is, this scenario is an aspirational scenario which bounces off the negative scenario which could happen if standing with Ukraine becomes the business as usual. A little bit not enough support, a little bit too late, a little bit afraid of escalation, red lines, and so on. So we kind of push off it and say, let's get it done. And definitely there is a cost of the war right now. In the first year, the estimates are that the energy shock due to the war in 2022 cost as much as 2% of global GDP, just that shock. And that's in trillions of dollars already, much more than the support. So there is I'm an economist by training, there's an economic argument to be made. Had the response or deterrence been stronger, these losses would not have been incurred. Had Russia been in check, in fact, the energy crisis in Europe would not have materialized. So the optimistic scenario is that the world will get its act together, become serious about stopping the aggression and constraining Russia, creating the conditions on the ground which will lead to the peace deal, sustainable peace deal, fair and just peace deal, which will create incentives for the future aggressors not to engage, and for Russia itself not to engage. Because I think the problem that Europe and the world is facing is bigger than the war in Ukraine. It's the aggressive Russia, which is not gonna disappear when we deny or lie to ourselves and strive for some end of hostilities and ceasefire. Russia is not gonna go anywhere, it's there. So the threat will be there. So, and that requires, in the case where we all get together, put money in, put support in, and stop Russia, and bring Ukraine and the world to the just peace, that actually will be the lesson to the world and to the international organizations, to the communities, that real politics, quote unquote, doesn't work. Justice works, the principles works. We talk about countries, but we are humans. We are humans who live on the planet Earth. We have to find a way to, save the planet and cooperate here. And that means that the entire world has to be stronger than Russia and other aggressors. Democracies have to be stronger because that's the future of humankind. If aggressors are stronger, the future of humankind is in question. So then, in our scenario, we actually win, democracies win, the world finds the strategic leadership back in democracies and finds a way to cooperate and move on to the bigger questions such as climate change, inequality, poverty. Okay, so the question is how to get people real about this. For example, in Germany, I think the war is abstract to them. The war is abstract. You have to experience things. So it has to become visceral. It has to be real. People have to travel, have to bring images back. It's truly, in my belief, it's really about communication. More, look at how the US politics today is. It's visceral in images, what's being debated. The war is more vivid than what people in Europe are willing to accept. This is a moral naivete. If we don't think about this, it doesn't exist. So that has to stop, and it's up to us, all of us, to make the picture of the future, which will happen if we don't get our act together, real for people in Europe and elsewhere in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Timothy. Well said. In a way, we just heard a classic expression of the idealist tradition in foreign policy, but it has at its core your scenario that Ukraine becomes a NATO member, which we've heard a number of times today is a goal of Ukrainian policy. And that brings me very naturally back to you, Condi. Obviously, you were present at not the creation, but at the enlargement of NATO, and you must have pondered often in these past 2.5 years about whether we might be in a different world if Ukrainian membership of NATO had happened. How do you think about that now? And do you think it is realistic today to speak of NATO accession for Ukraine?
Well, Neil, I'm going to take the advantage here, the possibility of making 4 quick points, and I'll come back to the last one about Ukraine and NATO. The first that I want to make is that, we haven't talked much about Vladimir Putin's worst nightmare and or worst scenario. Now, I do think that his best scenario was not achieved. He thought that within 5 days he was going to eliminate an independent Ukraine, and he failed at that. And so now the question about scenarios may be how to make his worst case scenario, which is that he really pays an enormous price for what he's done, to come into being. And one of the things that I would strongly suggest is that rather than sort of, again, grand scenarios, to become very granular about how to erode his international support. Support from China, support from North Korea, support from Iran. Because I think when you have Vladimir Putin going to Pyongyang, that suggests that maybe Russia's not in quite a strong position as some have suggested. And so I think some scenario planning on how to further weaken Russia's hand might be in order. I say that as an old Russianist who often thinks that Russia has some strengths, but it has some significant weaknesses as well. Secondly, I would say that as to scenarios in general, in 1989, I became the young Soviet specialist for George H.W. Bush. My guess is that in February of 1989, the one scenario we would not have planned for was a completely united Germany, fully and completely within NATO. Scenarios can only show you so much of the future. And so while it's good to do scenario planning, particularly on very specific issues, the one scenario that you probably haven't thought of is likely to be the one that comes into being. I would not have guessed that a year later, Germany would be fully united and within NATO. The third point that I want to make, and this leads to your question about Ukrainian security, is about US politics. It may be that we end up with a president who will get out of NATO, decide that Ukraine is not worth it, et cetera, et cetera. But Niall, you made a very important point about US politics. Very often policy is personnel, and you need to watch some of the people who are players, even on the Trump side, and what they are saying about the criticality of this war to U.S. interests. Because rightly, this has to be an argument about how it affects U.S. interest. And I think the strongest argument is the one that we've been hearing, that a world in which a large neighbor can extinguish its smaller neighbor is not a world in which we will want to live. I think it's also an argument that every time the United States has tried to ignore what is going on in Europe, we have been dragged in, whether it was into World War I or World War II, or frankly, what happened to us on September 11th when we thought that the fight was out there and it turned up being in American cities. The third argument that I would make to the American people is that we cannot separate what is happening in the Middle East after October 7th, because of the Iranian hand in that, from what is happening in the Indo-Pacific with China's aggression and what is happening in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, the mullahs in Iran are all after the same thing. That is to overthrow the international order as we have known it, and as the last speaker said, to replace democracy with authoritarianism worldwide. And so I think that's an argument that the American people will understand. And it's why I'm not as pessimistic about the American political scene and its reaction, whoever is in the White House. And then the final point is about Ukrainian security. I was at Bucharest in 2008. Nobody argued more strongly for membership action plan for NATO than President Bush and the Bush administration and I personally. I remember those long arguments with the Germans and with others, with the East Europeans saying something that turned out to be true, that if we left a vacuum in Europe without Ukraine with a clear road to NATO membership, we would pay a price for it. The Poles said that, the Baltic states said that, they were right. And I do wish we had been able to bring Ukraine closer to NATO and on a path to membership at that point. That's behind us. I personally will be arguing for Ukraine to accede to NATO. I think that's the best answer. I think it does not leave a vacuum. Vladimir Putin, I do not believe, wants any part of the countries that have an Article 5 commitment. And so, yes, I will argue for NATO accession, for Ukraine accession to NATO. Whether or not it can get done, that's another question. But I think the argument has to be made, the argument has to be joined. And if we can make the argument that it is also in the US national interest that there not be a vacuum in Europe into which aggression can once again flow, then maybe we have a chance.
Connie, thank you so much. I know you have to leave now. Please, a round of applause for Secretary Condoleezza Rice. We have just under 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that our panelists get a final word. There are a number of short interventions that we're going to have before we return to the stage. And the first of those is going to be from Michael Froman, President of the Council on Foreign Relations. If we could pass the microphone to him. I'd urge these words to be on the brief side, or we're going to run out of time. Michael.
Okay, very brief. First of all, thank you, Victor, for organizing a conference on the necessity to win. I've been sitting here today wondering what it means to win, and this has been really the first panel to discuss those scenarios. I think where you end up on these scenarios come down to four questions, which are somewhat uncomfortable. What military gains need to be made from here to define winning? Is it 1991? Is it 2014? Is it something else? 2, how strong and enduring is Western support likely to be for Ukraine? Taking Condi's warning into mind that not everything said in a campaign should be taken as policy, I think there are 2 very distinct views on the candidates on Ukraine and on NATO. And I think people can make their own judgments about how long the support will be there. I would say no matter who wins for president, I do see U.S. support for Ukraine diminishing over time. And so I think Ukraine has to prepare for that simply because there's fatigue, distraction, other issues, and there will be a focus on domestic. 3rd, how real is the prospect of NATO membership? Is it, and will Ukraine be able to meet the conditions that are likely to be put on it? And are there alternative security arrangements that could be meaningful in the meantime? And the 4th, just on recovery and reconstruction, how can Ukraine mobilize the kind of external support it needs to start that process? The $50 billion that the G7 agreed to with the loan based on the assets hasn't moved. Ukraine's been amazingly effective in putting pressure on the United States government on various military issues. It might turn its attention to France, Germany, Belgium, others that are standing in the way of that getting done.
Thank you very much, Michael. Fareed, you kicked this show off this morning interviewing President Zelensky. I wonder if we can hear from you. I hesitate to pass the microphone when you are somewhat weary from a train ride last night, but maybe a quick word from you, and then I have one final very special just after Fareed. Yeah.
Sure, Neil. I had 2 thoughts. One, I think this exercise in scenario planning is excellent because it reminds one that prediction is not an exercise in prophecy, but an exercise in leadership. In other words, there is no future out there that smart people are meant to be able to see and know like prophets. The future out there depends on what we do today. It is the cumulative acts of leadership that will determine which of these scenarios happens. And my second point is, don't make the mistake, all of us, of underestimating the power and the staying power of democracies. I'm old enough to remember these debates in the 1970s and 80s when lots of very smart people as smart as George Kennan and Jean-François Revel and Raymond Aron said, the West cannot compete because the Russians have staying power. The Soviets will outlast us. It didn't quite work out that way. I remember after 9/11 when people said, the famous line about Al-Qaeda was, you have the watches, but they have the time, meaning they will outlast you. Well, where's Al-Qaeda now? I think that the truth is, while there is, of course, always debate and complexity and one side attacking the other side, the reality is that when Western countries believe their democracy is under threat, and I believe that this circumstance, for all the reasons that people have been discussing, is one of those, the West has extraordinary staying power. It has outlasted Soviet communism. It has outlasted Islamic fundamentalism. It will outlast Russian imperialism.
Yeah, yeah. And before we come back to the stage, I want to invite a very remarkable person, Yulia Payevska, whom I met, I think it was at the Munich Security Conference, and who gave, I think, the single most moving speech I've heard in my life, talking about your experiences as a military medic at the front line. Maybe your scenario is the one that I'm most interested to hear. Yulia.
Thank you. Please put on your phones. Exactly. Thank you.
I'll be speaking Ukrainian because this is my language. I'm at home. And as we are talking about scenarios, I am going to take the scene, but I will not need this now empty place because I have a place on my own. This is the line I'm standing in. I'm a part of it. One of those who will replace those fallen at this war. I invite everyone to join me. You don't need to don uniform, take arms. You can do it your own way. Regarding scenarios, will be concise and succinct because we are short of time. So this is the podium that sets the scene. We have powerful lighting that brings to light every minute things, even some specks on my glasses or whiff of my hair. We don't know one component though, because it's really a challenge to, somehow focus something. This is something that is behind this, stage. Now, why the Russians are getting the components to make the weapons you've been talking about, saying that they're quite quick with making it. Why it is so? I came out actually to this place to see your eyes, because before that I was sitting watching the eyes of my brothers, frontline brothers, those who are no longer with us. Please find some courage inside you, find some strength to look into the real source of those components that end up in Russian weapons. This is when we will be able to forecast our future. I do believe in the victory of Ukraine. I do believe we will overcome the problem. But they are focusing. I'm a psychologist myself. I do know how this works. They use every blow to teach you how to bring you into submission, to beat you into it. That way, every time they develop kind of a reflex in you. If you beat your dog loud enough, he will stop venturing into your room. This is how they, press onto us, onto the whole world. How to deal with it? I have no ready answers for it, but this thing we know already from the ancient Roman time. We need to solve that. Thank you, and glory to Ukraine.
Yulia, thank you so much. It helps us to focus on these faces on the wall in the final minutes of this panel and of today's discussions, and to remember that if we get this wrong, if we collectively get this wrong, there will be many, 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 many more young faces that will be on walls like this, and not only in Ukraine. So let me go back to my colleagues on the panel for some final reflections. Maybe let's start with Moritz. Let's talk about not the best case scenario, not the worst case scenario, but the most likely scenario that you foresee. And if we each give thoughts on that, it'll be an appropriate place to stop. Moritz.
Thank you, Niall. Let me give you an economic calculation maybe of a scenario that we all don't want. That's the defeat scenario, which is not the likely one, but maybe that's as an economist, an answer that doesn't start with "it depends." This is sort of the numbers that I can think about. There will be the costs of not doing enough are, I think, can be quantified quite clearly. There is going to be a need for much more military expenditure in Western Europe. If you think 2% was enough once in the scenario of a victorious Russia, that's not going to be enough. So pick your poison, but it's going to be 1-2% more of GDP that Western Europe will have to spend. That's quite a big cost. Then you'll have the human tragedy, you'll have many more refugees. You'll have the fiscal cost of that. You have the loss of trade. You can easily add another % of GDP to that. So that gives us 3% of GDP. And then we come to that many here mentioned, the cost in terms of deterrence that is no longer there. What Mike Pompeo called if the good guys lose, that will incite more conflict. It will be an incentive for the bad guys to be more aggressive. That's a hard calculation. It will increase conflict probabilities around the world. More sanctions, more decoupling. We've done a study on decoupling of the German economy from China. If that's a scenario that becomes more likely, it's probably going to be a cost of 5-6% of GDP. If that becomes 10%, 20% more likely, that's a real cost as well. In any case, you end up with significant costs, about maybe 4 or 5% of GDP for Western Europe of that bad scenario. And everything else then it will be less than that. And if you compare that, these 4-5% of GDP, to what we're doing now to help Ukraine, to these 0.1, 0.15, 0.2% of GDP, you end up with a very simple calculation. It's 20 to 30 times more expensive to end up there than to do what we're doing now. So it's in our own self-interest to do more, and we should be willing to pay much more and support much more to avoid these much higher costs that are waiting for us.
Thank you, Moritz, and keep saying this in Berlin. Francis Fukuyama.
Well, Niall, I reject the advice to exclude the extreme scenarios, because if scenario planning is going to be useful, you need to think about the black swans. You need to think about what seems very low probability right now and figure out how you would adjust to that kind of thing. Because if you ask people to say, well, what's kind of the middle most likely scenario in your view, everybody's going to say the same thing. It's just going to be like the present. We're just going to see either slow deterioration or maybe slow improvement, and that's not interesting. I think that there are a lot of wild swans or black swans that we have not discussed. For example, actually you mentioned this in your talking about China. It seems to me very likely that you're going to get some kind of a major conflict in East Asia, and that's not going to be a distraction from Ukraine. Ukraine's going to be a distraction from what's going to be, a real world war. So there's a lot of things that I think we really need to think about. How are you going to make the case for continued support for Ukraine when American soldiers are actually dying, trying to save Taiwan? I think that, those are the things we need to prepare ourselves for.
A sobering thought with which I'm afraid I agree. I give the last word to the person on the platform that has the weighty responsibility of government office. Ihor.
Thank you, Niall. I will pick up the point of Farid saying that we get a good exercise today. Yes, we had a good exercise of drafting and thinking of possible scenarios, but when tomorrow you will come to your chairs in the universities, auditoriums, or to your desks or to your computers, and you're gonna think about future scenarios, please take into account that all of what you produce, what you write, what you say, we are in the unified world. It is read and digested and thought over here in Ukraine. So when next time, I hope there are none here today who are giving us this scenario in the first half of the first days of open aggression, about 3, 5 days, 1 week, 2 weeks. So please, no more scenarios of a kind, because first we're gonna unprove them, as we did with the previous scenarios of Ukraine's defeat. And secondly, the more you produce the scenarios of a kind, dragging on the war or whatever, the lower morale you bring here to this country, to the brave men and women fighting on the front line in the trenches, and to the rest of us who are fighting on our own places. Secondly, When some of you speculate how many years will it take to Ukraine to become member of EU and NATO, I like the debate today between Boris Johnson and Mike Pompeo, where to go, to EU and NATO, and in the end they told both, yes, I agree. But when you try to speculate, it will take 8 or 10 years or 15 or whatever. No use. No use. On the very simple reason. First of all, we in Ukraine will be prepared to join both NATO and the EU by the time of our victory, and then a very quick political decisions hopefully can be made. So when you are speculating now about these long-time scenarios, taking into account the experience of other countries, it's of no use. Ukraine will enter EU and NATO in quite different geopolitical circumstances and using its quite absolutely unique own experience gained on the battlefield. And thirdly, when you are still thinking of how to be united, how to be more helping, and thank you for not only thinking but finally doing it, although slowly but gradually, but too slow enough. Look at these rogue states which we talked today about. Look at the level of unity which Putin, mullahs from Iran, and North Korea are having now. The high level of unity and coordination they have between themselves. Look at them and think that you have to be ever united, as strongly as united with Ukraine as possible. And only in this case we're going to win. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ihor. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the vision that brought us here was in large measure Victor Pinchuk's. The idea that we should have scenarios, we should force ourselves to think about the futures we have to choose between was his. Please give a round of applause to Victor for all that he does to convene this extraordinary event.